We'll now have 10 minutes of questioning between Dr. Craig asking Dr. Kagan about his thoughts.
Well, obviously, a number of questions came up in my talk that would be pertinent to what you shared, Shelley. In your opening address, you said right or wrong depends upon whether you hurt other people without justification. And when asked, are these really wrong, you answered yes. Why? Because it harms the victim. Now, I guess my difficulty is that I certainly agree that it's wrong to harm people, obviously, but it's hard for me to understand on a naturalistic worldview, such as I described, why on the worldview of naturalism, inflicting harm upon other members of our species is really wrong. It seems to me that this happens all the time among other animals, and so why is it wrong peculiarly for human beings to inflict harm on each other?
All right, so let's start with that. Suppose that my 3-year-old nephew walks into your house, takes some book off your shelf, and tears the pages out. He hasn't done anything wrong. Or 3-year-old's probably old enough he has done something wrong. Like a year and a half, he hasn't done anything wrong. If I go into your house, tear some pages out of your book, I've done something wrong. What's the difference? Well, I'm capable of appreciating reasons for respecting your property that my 1.5-year-old, this is hypothetical 1.5-year-old nephew, doesn't have the capacity. Right? There are differences between people that allow me and you to think about our behaviors, to evaluate our behaviors, to see whether or not there are legitimate reasons for behaving as we do. Creatures that don't have that capacity don't have that capacity. It's precisely because they lack that capacity that makes no sense that the notion of right and wrong behavior gets no purchase. Lions can't reflect upon their behavior, so when they do it, it's not wrong. If you or I were to engage in that behavior, we can reflect upon that. We can recognize the reasons for not behaving that way. So I think the distinction is a fairly straightforward one, not a deep mystery or a hard challenge for the naturalist to respond to.
Okay, I think that's a good answer for why we wouldn't regard animals as moral agents who would be culpable for their acts. But it seems to me that at best that answer would go to show that rationality or the ability to reflect rationally on things is a necessary condition for moral behavior, but I don't see that that's a sufficient condition for moral behavior. It's still not clear to me why it would be wrong for creatures who have considerably complex neurological systems to inflict harm on each other on a naturalistic worldview in the struggle for survival.
Okay, so the question you asked initially was, how can I explain why it's wrong for me to murder when it's not wrong for lions to murder? And to answer that question, all it takes is for me to point out a relevant difference between us, and you've just, I think, said, yeah, all right, so I managed to do that. If we now shift to the question, so what does it take for wrongness to enter the world above and beyond rationality? I think the answer might well be, actually, once we achieve a certain level of rationality, nothing more is taken. Nothing more is needed. The reason it's objectively wrong for me to engage in murder is precisely because there is a reason for me not to do it. A reason that I'm capable of recognizing. And if you ask, what more does it take? The answer is, well, those are the basic ingredients right there. We can refine it. I mean, we can put a little icing on it if we'd like to make it. But in terms of the essentials, that's it. What there's reason for me to do depends on what kind of creature I am. Once I become the kind of creature in the evolutionary, process, once creatures evolve that are capable of stepping back from their actions, capable of reflecting about whether or not their behavior makes sense, whether it conforms to standards that they are themselves prepared to endorse, at that point the machinery is in place. And at that point, there are reasons for me to behave in certain ways and to avoid other kinds of behavior. And if you ask, but what makes that wrong?
I'm still not clear as to why these beings suddenly achieve intrinsic moral worth in virtue of having these complex nervous systems that enables them to have self-reflection and so forth.
If you put it as complex nervous systems, it sounds pretty deflationary.
Right.
What's so special about having a complex nervous system? But of course, that complex nervous system allows you to do calculus. It allows you to do astrophysics. It allows you to write poetry. It allows you to fall in love. Put under that description, you ask, what's so special about humans from a naturalistic perspective? I'm at a loss to know how to answer that question. If you don't see why we'd be special and different from everything else in creation, that because we can do poetry, we can write a novel, we can think philosophical thoughts, we can do calculus, and we can think about the morality of our behavior, I don't know what kind of answer could possibly satisfy you at that point.
Well, obviously, the kind of answer that I offered, but
can I ask just to follow up on that? Because I mean, I'm tempted to say I could play this game, and that's unfair, because of course it's not a game. But I could pose the same kinds of questions to you. Perhaps I will. You know, in 10 minutes, I could say, look, all right. So God says, you know, you guys are really, really special.
Right.
How does his saying it make us really special? But you see, he gave us a soul. How does our having a soul make us special? Whatever answer you give, you could always say, with regard to that, what's so special about that? At a certain point, you're just going to have to say, you know what? These features really do seem to me to be special. Insofar as it seems to me that our ability to communicate, to reflect, to love, to be creative, and consequently to shape our behavior with an eye towards how we're interacting with one another, these things strike me as remarkable ways in which we're special.
I think that they strike all of us that way, and that's the difficulty, perhaps, I think, in showing what I'm attempting to show, is that we all do, I think, intuitively value one another. We value persons. We value poetry, creativity, and all of these things. I think we all agree that these are goods. The question is, though, on a naturalistic view, why think that these things are goods? It seems to me that you emphasize in your own book, On the Limits of Morality, the importance of having explanations and not cutting off the search for explanations too soon. And I wonder if you're not cutting off the search for explanations too soon by simply saying, well, I'm just going to regard persons as intrinsically valuable, but without any kind of further grounding for that.
Well, of course, I haven't claimed there is no further grounding for that. I gave you a sketch of the contractarian thought. Your attitude was, I don't find that a very compelling story. It doesn't seem to me to be the kind of thing that constitutes an adequate grounding. I suppose these things are in the eyes of the beholder, and everybody here is entitled to decide for themselves what kind of answers will be satisfactory or not.
Let me ask you a different question.
One more.
Oh, okay. Are you a determinist?
Yes.
And yet you still think that love is significant and human choices are morally significant, even though they're determined?
So to give a piece of jargon to the audience that Bill will be familiar with, I'm a compatibilist. That is to say, I believe that one can combine determinism and free will. So absent free will, humans would lack the significance that we clearly have. But I believe that's compatible with determinism. Actually, am I a determinist? Who knows what quantum mechanics teaches us about whether or not determinism is true. But at least I believe that determinism could be true without in any way threatening my conviction that humans are special.
Did you have a follow-up on that one?
Well,
I think you did.
Only to say that it just seems to me to rob moral choices of any sort of significance if we're determined to do it by the antecedent physical causes that lead up to the point of choosing, and then cause our brains to react one way rather than another. I can't see how that could have any more moral significance than a tree growing a branch at a certain point in its development.
Because you're an incompatibilist. You don't believe determinism and free will. So this is a debate for another night. I mean, it's not that I think the truth of compatibilism is at all self-evident.
Can you just explain what that term means?
Compatibilism is the view that there's no logical inconsistency between belief in determinism on the one hand and the existence of free will on the other. They're compatible.
Well, that's
I
a
don't,
little bit misleading, though. I mean, you need to explain what you mean by free will in that case, if everything's determined.
What I was trying to do is simply give a quick definition. Remember, I said that this is a very, as you know, it's a very, very complicated question. We would basically hijack the entire rest of the evening to start trying to...
I'm unclear on the terms myself.
Right. So my thought was just that the plausibility of the compatibilist view that I hold, I don't take to be self-evident. I believe it takes philosophical argumentation for it. I completely agree that those drawn to incompatibilism, those drawn to the view that you can't have both deterministic physical laws and robust free will think, if naturalism is true, and the best science teaches us that determinism is true, itself a controversial question whether that's the best interpretation of our best science, then we'll lack free will. And then if free will is necessary for having special value, then we'll lack special value. But there's a lot of premises before we get to the conclusion that naturalism doesn't have space for this special value. And I reject several of those premises, which is why I'm not feeling uncomfortable by the challenge that Bill's raising.
Well, let's turn the table, and now you'll ask Bill some questions.
All right. So one of the things that you said in your opening remarks, you quoted several people. I think there was a long quote from Michael Roos saying something like, if naturalism is true, if theism is false, then ethics is illusory, deeper meaning is illusory. That's not an exact quote, but I think those phrases were there. And I found that an interesting slide, or so it seemed to me. The move from ethics is illusory to deeper meaning is illusory. I think I want to concede that in the way you mean deeper meaning, I don't believe in deeper meaning. Because I think when you talk that way, you think for there to, not that I have any trouble talking about meaning or even deep meaning, but when you talk that way, I think you're thinking it's got to be meaning on a cosmic scale. That's where some of the points about accountability come in as well.
Yes.
So, fine, I believe that humans are just creatures that evolved on this tiny little speck of dust. But I don't see how the denial of deeper meaning should give me any reason to think, therefore I'm committed to ethics as illusory. So perhaps you could explain that.
Where that came in, I think, was with respect to moral accountability. And yes, and also with regard to the significance of human beings. It seemed to me that on a naturalistic worldview, everything is ultimately destined to destruction in the heat death of the universe. As the universe expands, it grows colder and colder as its energy is used up. And eventually all the stars will burn out. All matter will collapse into dead stars and black holes. There will be no life, no heat, no light, only the corpses of dead stars and galaxies expanding into endless darkness. And in light of that end, it's hard for me to understand how our moral choices have any sort of significance. There's no moral accountability. The universe is neither better nor worse for what we do. That ultimately there isn't, our moral lives become vacuous because they don't have that kind of cosmic significance.
I still need to have you explain that for me better, because again, it seems to me it's one thing to say it lacks eternal, cosmic, everlasting significance. Mm-hmm. It's another thing to say it lacks significance. In fact, to give one of your examples, you talked about, again, I don't remember the source of this quote, but the torturers, was it Nazi torturers?
Right, yeah.
And you say, if theism isn't true, then it doesn't really matter. This strikes me as, I'm sorry, I'm sure it's going to sound rude, but it strikes me as an outrageous thing to suggest it doesn't really matter. Surely it matters to the torture victims whether they're being tortured. It doesn't require that this makes some cosmic difference to the eternal significance of the universe for it to matter whether a human being is tortured. It matters to them, it matters to their family, it matters to us. So again, how do you move from the lack of eternal significance to the thought that if it doesn't have eternal significance, it can't have any significance?
Because